Welcome to Heart Yoga Radio. It's February 2021. I'm not sure of the date. It's a Monday morning. I'm taking my constitutional round the hill. It's a glorious day. Sun's out. There's some mist on the high hills there, which looks rather fine with the sun shining on it. And it's been raining for days and very, very grey and cold and windy. And that's kind of kept us off our podcasting routes to some extent. But be assured, we're still working on stuff, we're researching, and of course I do have projects in the pipeline which I've told you about, and they're still simmering away on the burner, and there's no shortage of material, but it does sometimes take a bit more time than you expected. So I'm going to do an interesting times today. I'm going to pick out a couple of things that I've heard whilst listening to YouTube and so forth, and surfing around social media and news media to see what's going on. And I'm going to try and draw out some bigger themes from those current affairs. So firstly, the case of Matt Hancock being found guilty by the High Court, or the government being found guilty by the High Court of breaking rules on the transparency of government contracts. And this is with relation to the Department of Health buying PPE, personal protection equipment, for healthcare workers who need protection in the situation of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And you probably know full well, and you've heard me mention it, I'm sure, on quite a few occasions, that the government's policy with respect to healthcare is to contract out many of its activities. Outsourcing, this is called, and if you go back over our podcast, you'll find that I did a fairly in-depth treatment of outsourcing, in which I examined the government's documentation and guidance on this matter. Anyway, the High Court finds that the government should have been transparent about the contracts, and it didn't. Matt Hancock, in an interview with Andrew Marr, said he'd got nothing to be ashamed of, he'd done nothing wrong. And life seems to go on as normal, and there seems to be a certain degree of impunity on the part of the government, which takes the form of, well, it's one law for everybody else and another law for us. After all, we are the government. Now, my source of information on that is that this is pretty well in the public domain. But the lawyer who drew attention to all this, and in fact who prosecuted the case on behalf of a project called the Good Law Project, Joyland Morn, was interviewed by Owen Jones recently on Owen Jones's YouTube channel. Just very recently, yesterday perhaps, I would think. So Joyland Morn was able to bring out a good deal of the detail, which has been sort of not that evident in mainstream media and press and broadcasting media. So secondly, Double Down News recently covered a similar territory, and particularly George Monbiot is very much on the case of this government corruption. And he makes the point in a very recent broadcast on Double Down News, which again is on YouTube, that Keir Starmer has been particularly silent about this corruption, and really, like Labour, should be having a field day pointing it out. And that's very interesting. And George Monbiot expresses quite a deal of despair about the actual lack of opposition and the way in which nobody seems to care that the government's getting away with this stuff. And literally billions and billions and billions of pounds worth of contracts have gone to Tory donors and their friends and some kind of pretty dodgy companies and setups which haven't done a very good job, particularly of providing the correct PPE equipment to the NHS. And basically it has amounted to many billions of pounds of public money being poured down the drain, or certainly into the deep pockets of friends of the right-wing oligarchs. And the third thing I want to mention is a remark made by Professor Mark Blythe in the context of a YouTube video, a fairly recent one, certainly within the last week or so, on the subject of the possibility of Scottish independence and what kind of economic setup would Scotland need if it became independent. I can't actually remember the name of the channel, I just thought I'd take a look at it. Anyway, Mark Blythe's remark had the gist that some years ago, some decades ago, the UK government was sort of not very corrupt, is how he put it, I think. You know, there wasn't just huge amounts of corruption. There's obviously going to be some, but there weren't huge amounts of corruption with the UK government. But now, the levels of corruption are Southern European. He called it Southern European levels of corruption, is his way of putting it. And Mark Blythe is an interesting economist. He's, I would say, a left pragmatist. He's not necessarily a Marxist in all respects, left pragmatist. But he's got a very good grasp of detail on finance, capital, relationships with government, currency, international economics and how national economies work, and all the stuff about deficits and debt and all the rest of it. He's kind of got a detailed, broad stroke knowledge of macroeconomics. So he's somebody I trust. I kind of think I relatively trust George Monbiot. Don't agree with everything, but he applies reason and he tries to get his facts straight. Similarly, Joylon Moore, I find him a funny character. I follow him on Twitter, and sometimes he's completely right on, and other times it seems to me he lost the plot, you know. So, but he's certainly a very sharp lawyer, and this project, which is one of taking the government to task in the courts, is a good one, and it's very well done. And they say they had a victory in the case of the Department of Health and Matt Hancock. So what I want to draw out of that is a couple of things. One is that the startling assertion I'm prone to make that the UK is already a fascist state. It's not like incipient fascist or about to come back. It's already fascist in the sense that the government and capitalism, particularly corporate capitalism, are completely enmeshed. And I made this point in some quite fine detail with respect to Serco and outsourcing. But this hasn't had much airing in the public domain, but here it is, coming out in court and in a trial which takes the government to court, and in which the government is found wanting. So that's kind of reiterating in a stark and obvious and simple way that this entanglement of state and corporate power is already pretty fully well established in the UK polity. The second thing, in the same vein but slightly distinct, is that the UK is a fascist state in as much as our present government has got authoritarian ambitions. And we see the Secretary of State for Health shrugging his shoulders, not resigning, when he's found to have broken the law, and publicly stating that he's done nothing wrong. Now, we've already seen this tendency in Boris Johnson's premature prorogation in the run-up to the 2019 election. Which it was found to have been illegal. We also, you'll also recall that Boris Johnson said that he would rather die in a ditch than sign a letter to the EU regarding extensions, blah 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 blah, under the imperative of the Benn Act. But he had to obey it. He had to. But the Benn Act did make this a matter of law. Of course, Johnson does send the letter to the EU, but doesn't sign it. Don't put his signature at the bottom. Now, with the matter of the PPE, the government can claim that it has Parliament's consent to make decisions without reference to Parliament, that it can just kind of go ahead and do it and award these contracts without the usual rigmarole of committees and scrutiny and so forth, because it's an emergency. And Parliament did indeed grant the government the emergency powers of that type. But nevertheless, according to the court, the High Court, that doesn't absolve the government of its duty to make contracts transparent within a certain time period after the contract has been awarded. But there are numerous occasions of this authoritarianism, and there is behind that there is a question about the nature of democracy. Now, I often maintain that the UK is not really a proper democracy. It has some kind of democratic theatre which legitimates the governmental corporate power, but you have the choice between parties which are scarcely different. When somebody tries something different, they are crushed by the billionaire-owned press, as per the case of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. You have an elected second chamber and an unelected head of state, and an extremely dodgy lawmaking body known as the Privy Council, which enables things to be passed into law with very little scrutiny or public knowledge. So a democracy it ain't, but it has a little bit. We have local councils and so forth, and you can vote for your trade union leader, and you can vote within your political party if you belong to one. We have a little bit, but it's not a full-fledged democracy. But we'd like it to be, I think. Well, I certainly would like it to be. I think we might get somewhere if we did that. With respect to some of the problems that we face as a community, but as humanity. But suppose we did have a democracy, and the executive power of the government had that legitimacy of a genuine consent of the public, or at least enough of the public for them to be able to make it work. And if it functioned transparently, so that we could see what they were doing and that we could take to the streets if we didn't like what they were doing something nefarious, then you'd wonder if it was right for the judiciary to overrule an elected executive, an executive with the legitimacy granted to it through democratic exercise. Bear in mind that the judiciary in the UK is not elected. and it comes from a particular social class for the most part, not entirely, not exclusively, but mostly privately educated males, elderly. So you would wonder at the legitimacy of the Supreme Court or the High Court or any kind of part of the judiciary overruling the government. That's an interesting question. Because a parliament that was overruled by a court could then pass a law making it impossible for the judiciary to overrule the court, maybe on certain issues, maybe on a particular issue. As the lawmaking body, it would be able to do that. So I'm not saying I know the answer to this. I certainly like the idea that impulsive action on the parts of all powerful executives is something that no country should want. And even in emergency, you're going to want some scrutiny of executive power and some transparency in the exercise of executive power. These would be great desiderata. At the moment, of course, it's all a big fudge. There's no democracy. The judiciary is class biased. But in some ways, you're kind of glad that at least something can happen to expose and bring further into the light the corruption at the heart of the British polity. So there's some big questions in the midst of these current affairs, these current examples of discourse around some very interesting events. And I think at very least it makes us realise how much rethinking needs to be done. I think it really does. We do need to rethink pretty well everything if we're going to have a decent polity and any kind of future. There we have it. Further revelation of corruption and authoritarianism at the root of British political life. And on top of this, there's the absence of any opposition and relative media quietness about this. And the unwillingness of Her Majesty's opposition to push back against any of this is enough to make you feel that there isn't very much hope. I think the pushback is going to have to come back from the streets. This is not to say we turn our backs on the possibility of getting some capture of state power going. It's not to say one shouldn't, if you're so inclined, be involved in electoral politics, but it is to say without the street, without the unions, without social movements, there isn't going to be any pushback for the time being, at least, against what is a very dangerous situation. Anyway, I hope that was useful in some way. Wash your hands. Take care. Make knowledge great again.